Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. I still don't know if this is the right place to share something like this, but I haven't been able to let it go. It happened in August, and even now, months later, it keeps sliding back into my thoughts when I'm trying to fall asleep or when I'm alone in a quiet room. I can be doing something normal, washing dishes, driving to work, folding laundry, and suddenly I'm back in a tent, staring at nylon walls, listening to a sound that shouldn't exist in the middle of the woods. I've tried to talk myself out of it. I've tried to treat it like one of those strange nights that happens when you're camping, when the brain is already half alert because you're sleeping outside. I've told myself it was probably a person, probably something simple, probably a weird coincidence mixed with nerves. But the truth is, if I think about it long enough, I can still hear it. Not the memory of it, but the exact rhythm. I can still feel the cold, heavy fear that took over my body so completely that I couldn't move. I've been scared before. Most people who camp have. You wake up to an animal sniffing around. You hear a branch snap. You mistake a shadow for a person, and your heart jumps. This was different. This felt like my body knew something my mind couldn't explain yet. My boyfriend and I planned a small Vermont road trip with two close friends. I'll call my boyfriend Nate and my friends Olivia and Mark. The plan was simple: drive, camp, visit a few state parks, keep it easy. We weren't trying to do anything extreme. No deep backcountry hiking, no risky trails. Just a small trip where we could feel like we had escaped life for a bit. The first night we stayed at Jamaica State Park. That place mattered to me for reasons I didn't fully appreciate until that night. I used to go there as a kid with my family. I remembered it as peaceful. I remembered the sound of the river most of all, constant, soothing, like white noise that made the forest feel friendly instead of empty. I remembered bird calls in the morning. I remembered crickets at night. I remembered falling asleep to a mix of water and leaves and small animal movement, the normal living sound of a healthy forest. I had a kind of trust in that place because it was tied to childhood. Even though I knew that parks change, that forests change, that memory can smooth over details, I still carried that feeling that Jamaica was safe. Familiar. Almost like a piece of home that happened to be surrounded by trees. The evening started normally. We checked in, drove around the loop, found our site, and got to work. We set up tents, laid out sleeping pads, and put food away. We gathered wood and got the fire going. The air had that late summer feel that's hard to describe unless you've sat outside in it. A coolness that doesn't bite yet, but reminds you night is coming. Warm enough to be comfortable in a hoodie, chilly enough that the fire feels like a good decision. We settled into that slow, easy rhythm camping gives you. We talked, we laughed, we ate snacks that tasted better simply because we were outside. Nate poked at the fire like he always does, even though it didn't need poking. Olivia told a story about work. Mark argued about the best route we should take the next day. Nothing was tense. Nothing felt wrong. But the first strange thing we noticed wasn't something we saw. It was something we didn't hear. The woods were silent. At first it was so subtle I almost didn't recognize it. Silence can creep in slowly and you don't notice until you catch yourself listening for something that never comes. But once I noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. There were no crickets, no cicadas, no birds shifting in branches as they settled down for the night. No owl calls, no distant rustling, no frogs. Nothing. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It wasn't the calm quiet of fresh snow or a windless morning. It was an empty silence, like the forest had gone still on purpose. It pressed into your ears and made your own sounds feel too loud. I could hear the tiny crackle of the fire. I could hear someone swallowing. I could hear our clothes moving when we shifted. I could hear my own breathing and suddenly felt like it was rude, like I was making noise in a place that didn't want noise. I mentioned it casually, trying to keep my tone light. Nate tilted his head like he was checking too. Olivia made a joke about horror movies and how we were definitely about to be haunted. Mark laughed, but it was the kind of laugh you do when you don't want to admit something is bothering you. We brushed it off the way people brush off small discomforts. Sometimes nature quiets down, sometimes weather changes things, sometimes bugs aren't active. Maybe it was cooler than usual. Maybe something happened earlier in the day that pushed animals away. We didn't know, but we didn't treat it like a warning. We were in a state park, not the middle of nowhere. There were other campers, there were rangers. There were bathrooms with lights, which somehow makes everything feel safer even if it shouldn't. Eventually, we put out the fire, did the normal last checks, and crawled into our tents. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened again. Still nothing. No soft chorus of insects, no background life, just the faint river, and even that seemed oddly distant, as if the sound had been turned down. In my memory, the river had always been louder at Jamaica. That was part of why I loved it. That night, it sounded like it was farther away than it could possibly be. I tried to ignore it. I told myself my childhood memory was probably exaggerated. I told myself I was overthinking. I shifted in my sleeping bag until I found a comfortable spot and eventually drifted off. I don't know how long I slept. It could have been 2 hours. It could have been 4. But when I woke up, I came out of sleep instantly, fully awake, like someone had flipped a switch. No grogginess, no slow, sleepy confusion, just alert, heart already starting to pound, body already bracing. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a loud banging sound outside the tent. Jamaica State Park has campgrounds laid out in loops. There's a paved road that curves through the sites. The sound was close to that road, close enough that I could picture it moving along the pavement. It wasn't a soft sound. It wasn't a twig breaking. It wasn't an animal bumping a cooler. It was a solid, deep, metallic clang. It sounded like someone taking a heavy piece of metal, like a thick pan, or a pipe, or a tool, and striking it against something else. Bang. Then a pause, long enough that I could hear my heart. A bang. Then another pause. Bang. Every 5 seconds, almost perfectly. Like a slow metronome, like a person counting time. The first instinct my brain offered was simple. Someone is walking around the campground, hitting something. Maybe a drunk camper. Maybe someone being stupid. Maybe someone trying to scare people. Maybe some kind of late-night maintenance. Maybe a ranger trying to deal with a problem. But as the sound continued, that explanation started slipping, because there were no footsteps. When people walked earlier in the night, you could hear the crunch of gravel, the soft slap of shoes on pavement, the little scuffs and shifts. You could hear them stop and start. You could hear them breathe if they were close enough. You could hear zippers, talking, even muffled coughs. This was just the bang, nothing else. And it wasn't staying in one place. It moved. I could track it through the tent wall as it traveled along the loop road, passing site after site. The bangs stayed steady as it moved, as if whatever was making them didn't need to change rhythm to navigate. It didn't speed up. It didn't slow down. It didn't stumble. It didn't pause to adjust or look around. It went around the loop once, then it went around again. It circled the campground like it was tracing it, like it was measuring it, like it was checking each site without ever stepping into one. The worst part was how clean it felt. Not clean like neat and tidy, but clean like a machine. Living things aren't perfect for long. People get distracted. They cough. They trip. They stop to whisper to someone. They change pace without meaning to. Animals are even less predictable. They move in bursts. They pause and listen. They make small noises you don't notice until you're paying attention. This had none of that. Bang, pause, bang, pause, bang. I lay there frozen. I didn't sit up. I didn't reach for my flashlight, even though it was right there. I didn't wake Nate, even though I could have whispered his name. I don't know why. I think a part of me was afraid that making any sound would be like raising my hand in a classroom and saying, "I'm awake, I'm listening, I'm here." The silence underneath the bangs made it worse. The forest stayed dead quiet. No crickets to blur the edges of the sound. No leaves rustling. Nothing to soften it. The bangs echoed cleanly through trees and across pavement. I tried to force myself to move. I tried to tell myself to unzip the tent and look. That's what you do when you're a logical person. You check, you confirm, you don't let fear fill in blanks. But my body refused. It wasn't like a choice. It was like my muscles simply didn't respond to the idea. My arms felt heavy, my hands stayed clenched, my breath stayed shallow. The only thing that moved was my eyes, staring at the dark fabric inches from my face. I kept thinking, if I unzip the tent, it will be right there, not walking away, not down the road, right there, standing in the doorway, waiting like it knew exactly when I would decide to look. That thought felt ridiculous, and yet it was the strongest thought in my head. At some point, the banging moved farther away. I could tell it was reaching the far side of the loop, the part where the road curves out of direct hearing range. The sound softened slightly, then grew louder again as it came around. That's how I knew it was circling. It wasn't just passing through, it wasn't just one lap. It was doing it again and again with the same steady pace. I tried to count how long it lasted. Time felt strange. Fear stretches minutes. But if I had to guess, it went on for about 20 minutes. 20 minutes of being trapped inside my own tent, listening to something make the same sound over and over, like it was marking off seconds on the clock. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. There was no fading away into the forest, no final bang in the distance. It just ended, as if someone had flipped another switch. After that, the silence was even worse. Now it felt like the whole campground was holding its breath. I lay there wide awake for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. Waiting for footsteps, waiting for voices, waiting for a door to unzip, waiting for someone to cough, anything that would prove the world was normal. Eventually, exhaustion must have grabbed me, because the next thing I remember is morning light bleeding through the tent. When we got up, the daylight made everything look harmless. Birds chirped, leaves moved. The campground looked exactly like a campground should. People walked to bathrooms with sleepy faces. Someone started a stove and the smell of coffee drifted. It was the kind of morning where you almost feel silly for being afraid at night. But the memory of the banging didn't feel silly. It felt sharp, like it had happened a second ago. As soon as we were all awake, I asked if anyone heard something during the night. Nate looked confused. Olivia shrugged and said she slept through everything. Mark's face changed immediately, like he'd been waiting to see if anyone else would say it first. "Yeah," he said, "I heard it." He described it almost exactly the way I would have. Loud, metallic banging, steady rhythm, moving around the loop, no footsteps. Hearing him say it made my stomach drop and relax at the same time. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't dreaming. Someone else heard it too. Mark tried to laugh as he said it, and I matched his tone because that's what you do when you don't want your fear to take up space. We joked about it, called it weird, suggested it was probably someone drunk, but the truth was in our eyes. We were both unsettled. Later that day, I walked to the ranger area and asked a ranger if moose ever came through that campground. I wasn't expecting her to say yes. It was just the first normal explanation that had floated around our group. Moose are big. They can make strange sounds. People who haven't heard them can misunderstand what they're hearing. The ranger smiled like the question was funny. She said moose were in Vermont, sure, but seeing one in that exact area, in that part of the park, wasn't common. She didn't sound alarmed. She sounded like someone answering a harmless tourist question. I told her about the noise. She listened politely. She didn't laugh at me, but she didn't offer an explanation either. No, that's probably X. No, that's happened before. No, that's a known issue. She just nodded and said she would listen that night as she fell asleep and let us know if she heard anything. The calm way she handled it should have made me feel better. In a way, it did. If something dangerous was happening, wouldn't a ranger react differently? Wouldn't she be more concerned? Wouldn't she have a clear answer? At the same time, her lack of explanation made the mystery feel heavier. It was like she had heard stranger things than that, or like she didn't want to say something that would scare people. The rest of the day went normally. We explored, we took pictures, we cooked, we sat around another fire, we joked about the banging in that half-serious way people joke about things they can't explain. But behind the jokes, I could feel the edge in all of us. We kept glancing into the trees, we kept listening, we kept waiting for the forest to go silent again. That night, we went to sleep ready, flashlights beside us, shoes near the tent door. The kind of preparation that feels a little dramatic in daylight, but makes sense once it's dark and you remember how helpless you felt. And then, nothing happened. The woods were back to normal. Crickets sang, leaves rustled, small animals moved around with the soft, busy sound of life. It was almost comforting, like the park was trying to prove the first night was a fluke. I still didn't sleep perfectly, but at least I didn't lie awake, trapped in silence. In the morning, we packed up and headed north to the next campground, still making quiet jokes about the moose that didn't exist. The daylight made it easier to pretend it was just a strange night and nothing more. But there was one more detail that stuck to me from that first morning, something I couldn't shake. The campsite across from us had an ambulance parked at it. Someone there, an older man, had apparently had a medical issue. I didn't know what kind. I only knew an ambulance in a campground is not normal. It's the kind of thing that makes everyone suddenly speak softer. It's the kind of thing that reminds you how quickly a fun trip can change. For a while, I tried to connect that to the banging. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he wandered. Maybe he hit something by accident. Maybe he was disoriented and doing something repetitive. The mind likes explanations that connect cleanly. But the more I thought about it, the less it worked. The sound I heard didn't match footsteps or human movement. And even if someone was confused, the idea of keeping a perfect steady rhythm for 20 minutes while moving around a loop road without any other noise felt wrong. It didn't sound like a person struggling. It didn't sound like panic. It sounded like a pattern. Weeks passed, life moved on, but the memory stayed. The sound would pop into my head when I wasn't expecting it. Sometimes I'd wake up at home in the dark, convinced for a second that I could hear it again, only to realize it was nothing but the house settling. Then, on October 23rd, I was scrolling through TikTok and came across a video about the Bennington Triangle. I'm not someone who spends time in paranormal corners of the internet. I don't go looking for ghost stories. I'm a logical person. I like explanations you can test. I like the kind of world where things have reasons, but I clicked anyway, mostly out of boredom. The video showed a map of the area people talk about when they mention the Bennington Triangle, an area known for disappearances and strange stories. As the boundaries popped up on screen, my stomach dropped. Jamaica State Park sat right next to it. It felt like something cold slid down my spine, not because I suddenly believed in myths, but because my mind made a connection before I could stop it. A place with a reputation for strange events. And I had just had an event that felt strange in a way I couldn't explain. I started searching online. I read old stories and threads and articles. Some of it felt dramatic, some of it felt like people making patterns out of fear, but enough of it had the same tone. People describing the same uneasy quiet, the same sense of wrongness, that I couldn't dismiss it entirely. Then I found the detail that hit hardest. More than one person described hearing rhythmic, metallic banging sounds at night in that area. When I read that, I felt that same fear bloom in my chest, like my body recognized it before my mind could argue. It wasn't relief. It wasn't excitement. It was dread. The kind you feel when you realize something might not have been a one-time fluke. I'm still not saying it was supernatural. I'm not saying it was a creature or a spirit or anything like that. I'm not trying to turn my experience into a legend. I just know what I heard. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal moving naturally through brush. It was metal striking something in a steady, measured pattern, moving around the campground like it was tracing a circle. And the silence before and during it was the worst part. Animals go quiet for reasons. Even people who don't know much about the outdoors understand that. When the woods are alive, they make noise. When the woods go silent, something has changed. That night, the woods were silent like they were waiting. Months later, I can still picture myself lying there, frozen, listening to that steady clang make its way around the loop, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake Nate. I can still remember how my body refused to move, like fear had become a physical weight pinning me down. I can still remember the sick feeling that if I unzipped the tent, I would see something I couldn't unsee. Maybe someone was messing around. Maybe a ranger was doing something they didn't want to talk about. Maybe there's a natural explanation I simply don't know. Maybe there's some weird campground object that can bang in a way that carries and someone was dragging it or testing something, I don't know. But if it was a person, they moved without sounding like a person. And if it was a thing, it moved like it knew the campground better than I did. That's the part that keeps coming back to me. Not the sound alone, but the feeling that the sound wasn't random, that it had a root, that it had patience, that it went around and around with no hurry, like it had all the time in the world. Whatever it was, I hope I never hear it again. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, in a place where the forest didn't just surround you, it swallowed you. You could walk for hours without hitting a road or a fence. Just trees. Endless trees. My family always chose houses with big stretches of land, open fields that faded into woods thick enough to block out the sky. To us, that was normal. That was home. Those forests were my childhood. While other kids played in parks, my friends and I built forts in the underbrush and climbed trees that swayed high enough to make your stomach drop. We followed deer trails until we didn't recognize where we were anymore, then laughed and found our way back. The quiet of the woods felt like freedom. It felt protective. But even as kids, we knew better than to think it was harmless. There were always stories, strange men spotted near trails, someone watching from a distance, footsteps that stopped when you stopped. The adults brushed it off as drifters or campers, and sometimes that's exactly what it was. But there's a different kind of wrong you can feel in your body before your brain catches up. A cold prickle at the back of your neck, a silence that isn't peaceful. Near one of the houses we lived in, there was an abandoned home everyone called the witch's house. It wasn't an official name, just something that stuck. The place looked like it belonged in a story you weren't supposed to finish reading after dark. Windows shattered, roof sagging, wood warped and rotting from years of rain. Even in the middle of the day, standing across the field and looking at it made your stomach twist. No one told us to stay away. We just did. Between our land and the witch's house grew a wall of blackberry bushes. Not the tidy kind you see in parks, but thick, wild brambles taller than we were. The thorns were vicious. They formed a natural barrier that no kid would willingly crawl through. If the house wanted to be left alone, the blackberries made sure of it. One afternoon, my friend and I were exploring along the tree line and stumbled across something new. A tree house. It wasn't falling apart like the witch's house. It looked old, but steady. It stood behind what would have been the backyard of the abandoned property, partially hidden by trees. Neither of us had ever seen it before, and we'd spent years running those woods. That alone should have made us pause. Instead, we climbed it. The boards creaked under our weight as we pulled ourselves up. From the platform, you could see the back of the witch's house through gaps in the leaves. It felt like we were somewhere we weren't meant to be, not because we were breaking rules, but because the air felt heavier there. That's when we saw it. A shadow moved near the back door of the abandoned house. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a full figure standing in plain sight. It was just enough. A flicker, the sense of someone passing quickly behind the broken frame. We didn't say a word to each other. We climbed down and left. For a week, we tried to forget it. We told ourselves it was light shifting through trees, a trick of the eyes, anything but what it felt like. A week later, we were deeper in the woods on my family's property, north of the witch's house, far enough that we couldn't see it anymore. We were doing what we always did, climbing trees, finding sturdy branches to sit on, talking quietly. We weren't high up, just high enough that someone walking by wouldn't easily notice us. Then we heard it. A branch snapped, not the quick light crack of a squirrel, not the distant rustle of a deer. This was heavy, slow, deliberate. We froze. Another step, another branch under weight. The forest around us seemed to draw inward, every other sound fading until there was nothing but those steady footsteps. Then he stepped into view. An old man walked out from between the trees, coming from the direction of the witch's house. He wore a worn cowboy hat that looked older than we were. His flannel shirt was faded and soft with age. His jeans were dusty, worn thin at the knees. Everything about him looked weathered, like he'd been living outdoors longer than anyone should. He stopped near the base of our trees, and slowly, calmly, he looked up. "Hello, girls." My entire body went cold. We hadn't moved. We hadn't spoken. The shade from the branches covered us well. I had been certain we were hidden, but he looked straight at us, not searching, not scanning, directly at us. My brain tried to catch up. How long had he known we were there? Had he been watching before we even heard him? Why was he coming from that direction? No one lived at the witch's house. No one should have been anywhere near it. My friend, older and braver than me, managed to answer him. Her voice was tight but steady. I couldn't speak. My throat felt locked. The old man didn't smile. He didn't look angry either. He looked tired, worn down in a way that didn't match his steady posture. His eyes were sharp, though, too sharp. "I want you two to be careful in these woods," he said. "I've been around a long time, and I would not want you both getting hurt." The way he said it made something sink deep in my stomach. It didn't feel like a casual warning. It felt like he knew something specific, something we didn't. He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't ask questions. He simply turned around and walked back the way he came, toward the witch's house. He didn't look back. He disappeared into the trees. We stayed frozen for what felt like forever, listening, waiting for another snap of a branch. Nothing. When we were certain he wasn't circling back, we climbed down and ran. We didn't stop. We didn't look behind us. We didn't slow until we reached my house. For weeks after, we couldn't let it go. We watched the witch's house from the edge of our property with binoculars. Every afternoon, we looked for smoke, for movement, for lights at night, for any sign someone was living there. We never saw anything. No car tracks, no footsteps, no broken boards moved or repaired. The house remained empty, still, rotting quietly like it always had. That made it worse. If someone had been living there, we should have seen proof. But there was nothing. As kids, we tried to make sense of it. Maybe he was a neighbor cutting through the woods. Maybe he'd been hiking. Maybe he lived somewhere farther back and we just didn't know. But no adult used those woods as a shortcut. There were roads, trails, easier paths, and no one would willingly walk through the blackberry brambles around that house. The only clean path in that direction came from behind the witch's house itself. And then there was the part I still can't explain. How did he see us? We weren't moving. We were in shadow. I could barely see him clearly through the trees. But his eyes found us instantly. Years later, I asked around. No one recognized the description. Older neighbors said the witch's house had been empty long before I was born. My parents said no one had lived that direction in decades. Some said the last owner died under strange circumstances and the property had sat untouched ever since. No one mentioned an old man in a cowboy hat. As I got older, I understood that there are real dangers in forests. Trespassers, unstable people, things that don't need supernatural explanations to be frightening. But this memory never settled into something simple. It wasn't just that he was there, it was the way he spoke, the certainty in his voice, the weight behind his warning, as if he wasn't talking about getting lost or twisting an ankle, as if he was warning us about something we hadn't even noticed yet. And sometimes I wonder if he wasn't the danger at all. Sometimes I wonder if he was the only thing in those woods that didn't want us hurt. Whatever he was, drifter, hermit, ghost of someone long gone. After that day, my friend and I never wandered quite as far again. Whenever the forest grew too quiet, we turned back. Whenever that prickle crawled up the back of my neck, I listened, because I still remember the way he looked at us from below the branches, and I still believe he meant what he said. My hunting partner and I reached our usual hunting and camping spot, just as the last light was draining out of the sky. It was around 6:30 in the evening, maybe a little later. We had been on the road for nearly 6 hours without stopping for more than gas and a quick coffee. By the time we turned off the main highway and onto the narrow forest road that led into our spot, both of us were stiff, tired, and ready to be done driving. But we were also excited. That stretch of land had given us good turkey hunts year after year. It was quiet, dependable, and far enough off the beaten path that we rarely saw other hunters. That place always felt the same when we came back. Clean, open, peaceful. The fire pit would be cleared out. The old metal gate near the entrance would be closed the way we left it. There was never trash lying around. It was one of those rare areas where people respected the land. You could feel it. That was why the first thing we saw when we pulled in felt wrong immediately. Our headlights swept across the clearing, and instead of bare dirt and the usual circle of stones, we saw a pile of garbage near the fire pit. Wrappers, aluminum pans, a cooler, plastic utensils, torn paper plates. It looked like someone had eaten, packed up halfway, and either got lazy or left in a hurry. The mess wasn't just untidy. It felt careless, disrespectful. Above the pile, in 2 small pine trees, something else caught my eye. 2 logs had been leaned and crossed over each other like a small teepee shape. They weren't stacked randomly. They were balanced, angled downward toward the garbage like some kind of crude marker. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't practical. It was placed. We both noticed it at the same time. "What the hell is that?" I asked. My partner shrugged but kept staring at it. "Looks like somebody's idea of art." But his voice didn't carry any humor. We got out of the truck and walked around slowly. The air felt colder than it should have for early season. The trees around the clearing stood still. There wasn't much wind. The ground didn't show obvious signs of struggle or chaos, just that pile of trash and the crossed logs. After such a long drive, irritation faded into exhaustion. We talked briefly about cleaning it up in the morning. Right then, we just wanted to settle in. My partner's heavy-duty pickup had the camper attached in the truck bed, and we decided to leave it right there without removing it. We set up around it the way we always did. We gathered fallen limbs for firewood. We lit a small fire. We ate a couple of snacks and each had one beer. We didn't talk much. We were both worn down from the drive. Mostly we discussed the plan for the morning hunt, where to set up, how the wind was likely to move through the ridges, and which direction we'd split off at dawn. It felt normal, routine, the kind of comfortable quiet that comes from years of hunting together. Still, I remember glancing more than once toward that garbage pile and the strange crossed logs. In the firelight, the shadows from the logs stretched long and uneven across the dirt. I told myself it was nothing. Some careless campers who left in a rush. Maybe they had stacked the logs to keep animals out of the trash. Eventually, the fire burned down low. The sky turned fully black. The moon was bright enough to outline the tops of the pines and throw silver light across the clearing. It was the kind of clear night where every sound travels far. Around 10:30, we climbed into the camper. We didn't fall asleep right away. We were in that half-awake state, drifting but still aware of every small noise outside. The night was still. No wind rattling branches, no distant calls, just that steady forest quiet. At exactly 2:43 in the morning, I know the time because I looked at my phone immediately afterward. Both of us were violently jerked awake by an explosive bang against the back door of the camper. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a branch brushing metal. It was a full-force impact. The entire camper shook on the truck bed. The sound was so sudden and powerful that my chest tightened before I even understood what was happening. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice coming out thinner than I expected. My partner didn't answer verbally. He moved on instinct. He reached for his pistol and chambered around in one smooth motion. The metallic click of that action felt louder than the bang had been. I leaned toward the small rear window. The glass reflected some of the moonlight, but I could still see the outlines of trees. Nothing was moving. No shapes, no figures, no shadows slipping between trunks. 10 seconds passed, then 20. My partner reached over and flipped on the exterior floodlights. Harsh white light flooded the clearing. He didn't hesitate long before unlocking and opening the camper door. Every part of me wanted him to keep it closed, but I wasn't going to argue with someone who had already made up his mind and was holding a firearm. The cold air hit us as he stepped down. I followed just behind him. The floodlights lit up everything: the truck, the fire pit, the garbage pile, the crossed logs. Nothing had changed. We walked around the camper slowly. We checked the back door where the impact had landed. There was no dent, no scratch, no chipped paint, no sign of contact at all. That was when we noticed the blinds on the side window had fallen. They hung crooked, half detached. We looked at each other. "Maybe that's what it was," I said, though my voice lacked confidence. "The blinds?" he asked. We both knew blinds falling would not shake an entire camper mounted on a heavy truck. But in that moment, in the bright floodlights and cold night air, we wanted something simple to explain it. Exhaustion plays tricks on you. So does fear. We circled the truck one more time. The ground looked undisturbed. No tracks visible in the dirt. No crushed grass. No movement in the trees. Finally, we climbed back inside. Neither of us truly slept after that. We lay there, listening. Every creak of metal settling, every distant rustle of leaves made my heart race again. But nothing else came. At dawn, around 5 in the morning, we got up and geared up for the hunt. The early light made everything feel manageable again. The clearing looked ordinary. The garbage pile was still there. The crossed logs still leaned over it. As we hiked out into the woods, the routine helped calm us. But something else started to sink in. The woods were quiet. And not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. We're experienced hunters. We know what normal forest life sounds like. Even at dawn, there are small movements. Birds warming up, squirrels shifting, turkeys calling in the distance. That morning there was nothing. No calls, no chirps, no rustling. We walked several miles and saw no tracks. Not deer prints, not turkey scratches, not even raccoon signs near water. It was as if the land had been cleared out overnight. On the hike back to camp a few hours later, we talked it through more clearly. The blinds fell because of the bang, my partner said, not the other way around. I nodded. I had already reached that conclusion myself. Back at camp, we tried to recreate the sound. We slammed our palms against the camper's metal sides. We hit it with a piece of firewood. Even then, we couldn't produce the same deep, explosive force that had shaken us awake. And when we struck it hard enough to make a similar sound, it left marks. Small dents, scuffs. The camper was clean, not a single mark anywhere, not even on the roof, which we checked with a ladder. Then we studied the ground again. The dirt around the truck was soft enough to show boot prints clearly. Our own tracks were easy to see, but there were no other impressions. No hoof marks, no claw prints, nothing. We started ruling things out. A bear. No, a bear would have torn into the garbage pile. The cooler left behind by whoever had camped there before was still sealed. Our own cooler sitting outside was untouched. Bears do not ignore food. A deer? Impossible. They don't charge solid metal like that. A cougar or wolf? They don't slam doors. And they would have left tracks. A moose? It would have left deep hoof marks, and there was no sign of scraping or disturbance. We even considered another person, maybe someone messing with us. But no one walks up to a camper in the middle of hunting season and slams it hard enough to shake the vehicle, knowing the occupants might be armed. And if someone intended to steal, why leave everything? Chairs, coolers, gear. Nothing was touched. The more we talked, the more a heavier feeling settled over us. Something had hit that camper deliberately. It had hit it with force. It had not left marks. It had not left tracks. And the woods had gone empty. I found myself staring again at the crossed logs over the garbage pile. In daylight, they looked less dramatic, but still deliberate. The previous campers had left in a hurry. They hadn't bothered to clean up. The trash suggested carelessness, but the way it was left felt different now, as if something had interrupted them. Think they left fast? I asked. Maybe, my partner said. We didn't say what we were both thinking. We had both heard stories from other hunters told around campfires, stories that were never said too loudly, about something tall, strong, territorial, something that used intimidation instead of attack, something that warned you once. I don't jump to conclusions easily. I don't believe everything I hear, but every logical explanation had failed. We didn't speak the word at first. It hung between us. Finally, my partner said it quietly. You ever think about Sasquatch? He didn't laugh when he said it. I didn't laugh either. I've heard stories, I replied. So have I. We stood there for a long moment, the clearing silent around us. If it had been a bear, there would have been food missing. If it had been a person, there would have been tracks. If it had been a prank, there would have been damage. Instead, we had a single violent blow at 2:43 a.m., a fallen set of blinds, a silent forest, and a campsite that felt wrong from the moment we arrived. We stayed one more night. Nothing else happened. No bangs, no movement. The woods slowly returned to normal sounds by late afternoon. Birds came back. We saw a few distant deer tracks on the far ridge. But that second night, neither of us slept deeply. When we left on Thursday morning, loading up the truck and looking one last time at the clearing, I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief that nothing else had happened. Frustration that we had no answers. As we drove away, I looked back through the rearview mirror. The clearing disappeared behind the bend in the trees. I can't prove what happened that night. I can't say for certain what hit the camper, but I know it wasn't a branch. It wasn't wind. It wasn't exhaustion playing tricks on us. Something strong, controlled, and deliberate made contact with that door. Something that left no sign. Something that moved through those woods without disturbing the ground. And deep down, neither of us believes it was a bear, a person, or anything that walks openly in the daylight. I'm talking about the kind of stories that don't get written down for fun or passed around online for entertainment. I mean the kind that stay inside families, the kind that get told in low voices at kitchen tables after the sun has gone down, the kind that are repeated the same way, generation after generation, without anyone adding extra details or trying to make them dramatic. They are told simply, and that is what makes them heavy. They aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to guide you. I grew up with stories like that. My family comes from West Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I wasn't born there. My father moved to Germany before I was born, so my childhood was split between two places that could not have been more different. During the school year, I lived in Germany. Summers were spent in West Virginia with my grandparents. I used to feel like I lived two separate lives. In Germany, everything made sense. Streets were clean and organized. Forests had marked trails. People walked dogs and rode bicycles through the trees without fear. The woods were something you visited for fresh air and quiet. West Virginia felt older, not just older in age, but older in spirit. The mountains there don't look sharp and dramatic. They roll into each other like waves that froze in place. The trees are thick, layered, and endless. The valleys, what locals call hollows, hold shadows long before the sun officially sets. Even as a child, I could feel something different in those woods. In Germany, the forest felt neutral. In West Virginia, it felt aware, not magical, not glowing or mystical, just aware. Like it noticed when you stepped into it. My grandparents lived in a small house tucked into a hollow, surrounded by steep ridges and heavy forest on all sides. The gravel road that led to their place was narrow and uneven. At night, headlights barely reached past the next bend. There were no streetlights. Once the sun slipped behind the ridge, the light disappeared fast. Darkness didn't creep in slowly there. It dropped. My grandfather respected that darkness in a way I didn't understand at first. He wasn't dramatic about it. He didn't tell ghost stories. He didn't try to scare me. But there were rules. I remember one evening clearly. I must have been 11 or 12. It was late summer. The air was still warm, and the sky was that deep orange color that makes everything look softer. Their old dog, Teddy, was outside near the woodpile. I walked toward the door to bring him in. Grandpa stopped me. "It's past 6, he said. I looked at the clock. It was just after 7. "It's still light," I told him. "Don't matter," he replied. "After 6, you don't go out alone. And once the dark settles, you don't go out at all." I thought he meant animals. Coyotes, maybe. Bobcats. I had heard about black bears in the area. It made sense to me. I didn't argue. I just waited until he walked out with me to get the dog. But that rule stuck with me. It wasn't just about that one evening. It was constant. No wandering after dark. No walking the tree line alone. No standing outside listening to the woods once the sun was gone. When I got a little older, I asked him why. Before he could answer, my grandmother spoke from the kitchen. She didn't turn around. She kept stirring whatever was in the pot. "You don't talk about that," she said. "Talking about it brings bad luck." She didn't sound afraid. She sounded tired, like she had said those words before. Grandpa just shook his head slightly and muttered something about people who ignored warnings and never came back. Then he changed the subject. He always changed the subject. For years, that was all I got. When I turned 16, things shifted. I started helping him more. We cut wood together. We checked the fence lines. We walked old hunting trails he had used since he was young. He seemed to watch how I moved in the woods, whether I paid attention, whether I made noise, whether I treated the land with respect. One afternoon, while we were stacking logs, I asked him again, not as a child this time, but as someone who wanted the truth. He didn't answer right away. He set his axe down and wiped his hands on his jeans. "It ain't the woods that are dangerous," he finally said. "It's the things in the woods." He didn't smile. He didn't look at me to see if I was laughing. "Things?" I asked. He nodded once. "That's the best word for it." He never said creatures, never said spirits, never said demons or monsters. Just things. The word felt unfinished, like he was choosing it carefully to avoid saying something worse. "They watch," he continued. "Most times they don't bother you, but they don't like being bothered." He explained it slowly, like he was laying out instructions. "They'll turn you around, make you think you're walking straight when you're not. You'll swear you're heading home, and somehow you ain't." That's how people get lost, not by accident, by confusion. I wanted to question him, to point out maps and compasses and GPS. But standing there in the middle of those trees, with no houses visible and no road sounds reaching us, his words didn't sound foolish. They sounded practical. A few weeks later, I asked about the smaller rules, the ones that seemed strange even for mountain life. "Why can't we whistle?" I asked. He stopped walking. "Don't do that," he said quickly. "I'm just asking." He looked around before answering, which I still remember clearly. He didn't just answer. He checked the woods. "You whistle," he said quietly, "and the woods go quiet, dead quiet. That's how you know something heard you." I told him that didn't make sense. Whistling is just sound. "That's the problem," he replied. It ain't the right kind of sound." He said the forest has its own rhythm, wind in the leaves, birds, insects, distant animal movement. When you add a sharp, unnatural noise like a whistle, it stands out, it cuts through, and whatever listens to the woods notices. "If it goes silent," he said, "you don't wait to see why." He also told me not to play music outside. No speakers, no radio while working, no loud singing for fun. "It ain't about animals," he said. "Animals run from noise. These things don't." He explained it like it was about territory, like the forest belonged to something older than people, and artificial noise was a challenge. Then he told me about the cabins. Deep in the mountains, far from marked trails, there are old hunting shacks, some from the late 1800s, some from the early 1900s, rotting wood, collapsing roofs, windows broken long ago. "Don't go near them," he said. "Why?" "Because they ain't empty." I asked him if he meant squatters, other hunters. He shook his head. "They ain't empty," he repeated, "but you won't see what's there." He described how people who walked too close would hear footsteps behind them, or whispers that sounded like their own name carried in the wind. Not loud, just enough to make you turn your head. And when you turn, he said, you step off the right path. He didn't believe in Bigfoot. He laughed at Mothman stories when they came up on the news. He called those things tourist tales. But what he spoke about wasn't flashy. It wasn't something you'd put on a t-shirt. It was quiet. It was subtle. And that made it harder to dismiss. The reason I never fully brushed it off is because of the things we found. Once, near the edge of the backyard where the tree line thickens, we found footprints. Not animal prints. Not boot prints either. Barefoot, but too long and too narrow to look right. The ground had been soft from rain the night before. The prints led toward the woods, not away from them. Grandpa didn't say much. He just covered them with dirt using his shovel. Another time, deeper in the trees, I saw something made from sticks. 2 long branches crossed at the top, forming something like a crooked W. It wasn't random. The sticks were pressed into the ground firmly, angled in a deliberate way. I asked him who made it. He stared at it for a long time before pulling it apart and tossing the pieces aside. "Don't touch things you don't understand," he said. I wondered later if he had made it himself. But that didn't fit. He wasn't the kind of man who created fear for fun. He avoided attention. He didn't even like talking about these subjects. Back in Germany, if I mentioned any of this, people would smile politely. They would say every region has its myths. They would talk about old European folklore and how humans create stories to explain nature. Maybe that's true, but folklore doesn't usually come with strict rules that everyone follows without argument. Folklore doesn't usually make grown men stop talking mid-sentence. One evening, when I was 17, something happened that changed the way I thought about all of it. I was outside just before sunset, stacking wood by myself. Grandpa had gone inside to rest. I knew the rule about 6 p.m., but I thought I had time. The sky was still bright. The trees were glowing gold from the last light. Without thinking, I whistled. It was soft, just a short tune under my breath. The sound barely left my lips before everything stopped. The insects cut off first, then the birds. Even the wind seemed to hold still. The silence wasn't gradual. It was immediate, like someone had flipped a switch. My chest tightened. I stood there, listening. In Germany, silence in the woods feels peaceful. This felt thick, heavy, pressing against my ears. I remembered what Grandpa had said. If it goes silent, don't wait. But I didn't move right away. I told myself I was overreacting. That's when I heard it. Not a growl, not a branch snapping, just a slow step behind me. Soft but clear, the kind of step made by weight shifting on leaves. I turned. There was nothing there. The trees stood still. The shadows stretched long between them. Another step, closer this time. I didn't see anything move, but I felt watched in a way I can't fully describe. Not like someone standing behind you, more like something lining up with you, studying. I walked toward the house slowly at first, then faster. I didn't run, but I wanted to. When I reached the porch, the normal forest sounds came back. One by one, insects first, then distant birds. Grandpa was standing in the doorway. "You whistled," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He didn't yell. He didn't look angry. He just looked disappointed. "Don't do that again," he said quietly. I never told him about the footsteps. I didn't need to. Something in his face told me he already knew what I had heard. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. The woods outside the window sounded normal again, but every small noise made me wonder if something was closer than it should be. I realized then that the rules were not random habits passed down without thought. They were patterns formed by experience, by trial and error, by loss. Whether the things he spoke about are spirits, animals we don't understand, or something our minds aren't built to process, I can't say for certain. But I know this. The silence after that whistle was real. The footsteps were real. The fear that settled into my stomach was not imagined. And ever since that day, whenever I step into those Appalachian woods, I feel like I'm stepping into someone else's space. The rules were never random, the warnings were never for drama, and the woods have never felt empty since. When I was growing up, there was a man named Joe who was close to my family. He wasn't related to us by blood, but he had been around for so long that he might as well have been. He came to birthday parties, helped fix cars in the driveway, and showed up whenever someone needed a hand moving furniture or repairing a roof. He wasn't dramatic, and he definitely wasn't the kind of man who chased attention. If anything, Joe prided himself on being logical. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, spirits, or anything that couldn't be measured or fixed with tools. He didn't go to church. He didn't talk about religion. If someone mentioned something paranormal, he'd roll his eyes and say, There was always a reasonable explanation. That was just who he was. That's why what happened at the lake house changed everything. But the story really begins before that night, back when the lake house was still just an idea. Joe and his wife had always dreamed of owning a place by the water. The lake wasn't crowded or commercial. It was surrounded by thick woods and gravel roads that curved along the shoreline. There were no streetlights, no noise from highways, just trees, water, and sky. When they found a small piece of land tucked between the woods and the water, they bought it immediately. The land wasn't developed. No house, no plumbing, no road leading directly to the building site. Just trees and uneven ground. They poured everything they had into it, every spare dollar, every weekend. Joe worked his regular job during the week, and then Friday night he'd load up tools and supplies and head out to the property. His wife would come too. Sometimes friends and family joined to help with heavy work. They built that house themselves. It took months. There were arguments about measurements, about where the windows should go, about how much money they were burning through. Some weekends they worked until their hands were blistered and their backs were sore. But they kept going. They believed in that house. It was supposed to be their forever place, their escape from town, their peace. Eventually, the house was finished. It wasn't huge, it wasn't fancy, but it was solid and beautiful. You could stand on the porch and see the lake through the trees. At night, you could hear the wind moving across the water. The inside smelled like fresh wood and paint. They were proud of it. Everyone was proud of them. Within the first month of staying there, everything changed. Joe told the story the same way every time. Calm at first. Short sentences, no exaggeration. But when he reached certain parts, his voice would shift. It would go tight and strained, like he was trying to push the memory away while speaking it. That night had started normally. They had worked on something small during the day, installing shelves or finishing trim. Nothing major. By the time they went to bed, they were tired in that satisfying way that comes from physical work. Nothing strange had happened. No noises, no flickering lights, no shadows in corners. Joe fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up. At first, he couldn't tell why. He said it felt like being pulled out of sleep too fast, like something had shaken him awake from the inside. His eyes opened, but his body felt wrong. Before he could sit up, he felt pressure, not on his legs, not on his arms, on his chest and neck. He said it was immediate and undeniable. Something was pressing down on him. Something was wrapping around his throat. He couldn't see anything. The room looked normal. The ceiling above him was the same as it had been when he fell asleep. But he felt fingers, invisible fingers, tightening. He tried to inhale, and air barely came. His arms moved, but the rest of his body wouldn't respond. He tried to roll to the side. He tried to sit up. Nothing worked. His voice wouldn't come out. He said he tried to shout for his wife, but his throat was locked. In that moment, he didn't think about ghosts. He didn't think about demons. He thought he was dying. He thought maybe his body was failing him. A stroke, a seizure. There's something medical and terrifying. The pressure increased. He said it felt like something was sitting on top of him, pinning him into the mattress. The weight wasn't just imagined. It was physical, crushing. Meanwhile, his wife was in the next room. She hadn't heard him calling because he couldn't call. What woke her was the sound of something crashing, furniture being knocked over, glass breaking, heavy banging like a fight was happening. She jumped out of bed immediately. Her first thought was that someone had broken in. The house was new. They had tools and equipment. It wouldn't have been impossible for someone to try. When she reached the bedroom doorway, the scene stopped her cold. The bedside table was overturned. A lamp lay shattered on the floor. A glass of water had spilled across the carpet. Papers were scattered. And Joe was on the ground. He wasn't asleep. He wasn't groggy, he was fully awake, on his knees, gasping, clawing at his neck like he was trying to tear something off. She said his eyes didn't look like his eyes, they were wide and wild. He looked like someone who had just escaped drowning. He kept repeating the same words. It was choking me. Over and over. It was choking me. She ran to him, grabbed his shoulders, tried to steady him. She asked what happened, asked if someone had been in the room, asked if he had fallen. He couldn't answer clearly. He just kept touching his throat and shaking his head. The door was still locked. The windows were closed. Nothing else in the house had been disturbed. They stayed up the rest of the night. Joe refused to go back into that bedroom. He paced the living room, running his hand over his neck again and again like he could still feel something there. The next morning, the bruises appeared, dark marks around his throat, distinct, round, spaced in a way that looked like fingertips pressing in from both sides. His wife showed them to people. She wasn't hysterical. She was angry, confused. She didn't know what she was looking at, but she knew Joe hadn't done it to himself. The marks were too even, too deliberate. Joe refused to sleep in that house again. At first, everyone assumed he would calm down. He was the most rational person any of us knew. He would think it through. He would find an explanation. He didn't. He wouldn't step inside after sunset, not once. He would go during the day to fix something small or move supplies. But as soon as the light started to fade, he was in the truck. So sometimes he left tools sitting out mid-project. He didn't care. He just wanted distance. His wife was furious at first. That house had been their dream. They had poured everything into it. They had planned to move there permanently. Their home in town had already been listed for sale. Joe pulled it off the market without asking her. He wouldn't negotiate. He wouldn't try one more night. He wouldn't hire someone to check for gas leaks or structural issues. He wouldn't even consider sleeping there with a group of people. He was done. We still went to the lake on weekends. Kids slept in tents. Adults brought RVs. We fished and barbecued like always. But the lake house itself, finished, furnished, ready, remained empty at night. No one slept in it. Even as children, we felt something about it. Whenever we walked past the front door or the bedroom window, we moved a little faster. We didn't talk about it openly, but we felt watched, not by a person, by something that belonged there more than we did. Joe eventually stopped going to the lake entirely. At first, he said he was busy. Then he said he didn't want to make the drive. But the truth was clear. He didn't want to risk another night like that. He never offered an explanation. He never blamed the land, never blamed the house. He didn't start believing in ghosts. He didn't start going to church. He didn't change his worldview publicly, but something in him shifted. The way he talked about that night wasn't dramatic. It was controlled, almost reluctant. But there was fear under it, real fear. Years later, whenever someone mentions the lake house, the one nobody sleeps in, the room still gets quiet. Nobody laughs. Nobody rolls their eyes. Because we all remember the look on Joe's face when he said what happened. And we all remember the last thing he said, the final time he told the story. "I don't know what choked me," he said. He paused a long time after that. But whatever it wasn't human. I don't talk about that part of my life very often. When I've tried, people either smile in that careful way that says they think I'm confused, or they start offering explanations before I've even finished the story. Stress, lack of sleep, overactive imagination. I've heard all of it. After a while, it became easier to stay quiet. For several years, I lived in a small mobile home that sat directly against the edge of a national forest. Not down the road from it, not across a field. The tree line began only a few steps from my back porch. Tall pines rose up in a thick wall of green, and the underbrush was dense enough that once you stepped past the first few trunks, You disappeared. I liked that isolation at first. I had gone through a rough period before moving there. I wanted distance from noise and people and the constant feeling of being watched by someone's expectations. Out there, the only thing watching me was the forest, and that felt harmless, even comforting. The nights were my favorite part. I would step outside with a cigarette and lean against the porch railing. The forest never felt empty. It was alive in a steady, predictable way. Crickets pulsing in the grass, frogs near a shallow ditch farther out, an owl somewhere deep in the trees. Sometimes a raccoon would shuffle through the brush. Even when the moon was hidden and the sky was thick with clouds, I never felt afraid. The darkness felt full of life, not danger. When you live alone that close to the woods, the sounds start to feel like company. You learn their rhythm. You notice when a certain owl calls at the same hour every night. You recognize the difference between wind in dry needles and wind in fresh leaves. It becomes normal. That's why I remember the night everything changed so clearly. It was late summer, warm, still air. I stepped outside like I always did, cigarette in hand, thinking about work and bills and all the ordinary worries that fill up your head. The forest sounded normal, crickets steady, a faint rustle deeper in the trees. Nothing unusual. Then, without warning, a massive light appeared between the trees. At first, I thought someone had walked into the forest with a flashlight, but this wasn't a beam cutting through branches. It was too wide, too bright. It wasn't moving. My next thought was headlights from a truck on some back road I didn't know about. But there was no road behind my house, just miles of forest. And the light wasn't shaped like two beams. It was a single flat circle. The light itself was the object. It hovered there between the trunks, perfectly still, bright white, smooth, like a giant coin turned on its side and suspended in the air. It didn't flicker, it didn't sway, it didn't cast shadows the way normal light does. It illuminated everything evenly, as if someone had briefly turned on daylight in the middle of the woods. It was huge, as wide as my mobile home, maybe wider. It didn't rest on the ground or touch the branches. It just hung there. There was no sound, no hum, no engine, no crackle, just light. I stood frozen on the porch, cigarette burning between my fingers, staring. My mind tried to catch up. I waited for it to move, to shift, to reveal something behind it. It didn't. And just as my brain began forming the thought, "This can't be real," it vanished. Not dimmed, not drifted away. It disappeared instantly, as if someone flipped a switch and erased it. The moment it was gone, the forest went silent. The crickets stopped. The frogs stopped. The owl stopped. Even the faint wind through the branches died. The silence was worse than the light. It didn't feel like a natural pause. It felt like everything had been cut off, like the air itself had been emptied of sound. I slowly backed into the house. I didn't slam the door. I closed it carefully, as if noise might draw something's attention back to me. I sat down on the couch and tried to reason through it. Maybe it was some strange military test. Maybe a drone with powerful lighting. Maybe some optical illusion. But none of those explanations felt solid. I knew what I had seen. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to bed. I slept lightly. At some point in the night, I had a dream. In the dream, I woke up and walked to the sliding glass door that led to the back porch. Outside, sitting perfectly still in the center of the wooden boards, was a coyote. It wasn't pacing, it wasn't sniffing around. It wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was sitting upright, staring directly at me through the glass. Its eyes weren't angry. They weren't hungry. They were alert, focused, aware. In the dream, we stayed that way for what felt like a long time. Just looking at each other, I felt pressure in my chest. Not fear exactly, but tension, like something unspoken was happening between us. Then I woke up. Morning light was just beginning to filter through the trees. The dream lingered in my head, sin sharp and vivid. I told myself it was just my mind trying to process what I had seen the night before. I stepped outside for my usual morning cigarette, and there, sitting in the exact same spot from the dream, was the coyote. Same position, same stillness. It looked at me calmly, not startled, not ready to run. It just watched me as if it had been waiting for me to come out. I had lived there for years and had never once seen a coyote that close. I wasn't even sure they were common in that area. We stared at each other for several seconds. I didn't move. It didn't move. Then it turned its head slightly, stood up, and trotted back into the forest without a sound. No crashing through brush, no snapping twigs. It disappeared the way a shadow disappears when the light changes. That was when something inside me shifted. The forest no longer felt like company. It felt like proximity. After that morning, the air around the house felt heavier. The walls felt thinner. At night, even when the crickets returned, the sounds didn't comfort me the same way. Sometimes the silence would fall again, sudden and complete, and I would feel it physically, like pressure against my ears. I told myself I was stressed, that I was connecting unrelated events, that dreams sometimes blend into waking memory. I tried to go back to normal routines. Then came the night that ended it. I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It wasn't a dream. It was sensation, pressure. My eyes were open. I was staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, lit only faintly by streetlight filtering through the blinds. Something was on top of me. I couldn't see it, but I felt weight pressing down on my chest and arms. Not crushing, but firm, intentional. I tried to move. My body didn't respond. I have experienced sleep paralysis before. I know what it feels like. The strange half-dream state, the fuzzy edges of reality. This was not that. I was fully awake. My mind was clear. The pressure felt external, physical, as if hands were holding me down. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. My throat tightened. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. The air in the room felt thick, like humidity without heat, like something had filled the space above me. I don't know how long it lasted. It could have been a minute, it could have been longer. Time felt stretched thin. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the weight lifted. It didn't fade gradually, it lifted, like something had stood up from my chest. I gasped for air and rolled onto my side. My skin was drenched in sweat. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the sheets to steady them. I stayed awake until sunrise with every light in the house on. I stared at the bedroom door, expecting it to open. It never did, but the room never felt empty. The next morning I began planning my move. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I said I wanted to be closer to work, that I needed a change. I left within weeks. The new place was in town, far from any forest. There were streetlights, traffic, neighbors. But sometimes late at night, when I step outside and the world suddenly goes quiet, I feel it again. That heavy silence, the awareness, the faint pressure in my chest, like something remembering me. I don't know what the light was. I don't know why the coyote appeared the way it did. I don't know what held me down that night, but I know it wasn't nothing. Something shifted the moment that light appeared between the trees. Maybe something noticed me. Maybe something crossed into my space. Or maybe something inside me opened that I can't close. All I know is that I have never felt the forest the same way since. And sometimes, when the silence comes too fast, I wonder if whatever stood between those trees that night ever really left at all. I had been looking forward to that Vermont road trip for weeks. It was supposed to be simple. Just me, my boyfriend, and 2 close friends driving through the state, camping at a couple of parks, and enjoying those last warm days before fall started turning everything orange and cold. Life had been busy, and I wanted something quiet, something steady. Vermont in late summer felt like the right place for that. One of our planned stops was Jamaica State Park. I hadn't been there in years, but I used to go all the time as a kid. My parents would take me there for long weekends. I remembered the smell of damp leaves and pine needles, the way the road curved gently before opening into the campground, the small trails that seemed endless when I was younger. I was excited to show my friends a place that had felt safe and familiar for so long. We arrived in the evening, the sun dipping low enough to cast long shadows between the trees. The air was warm but not humid, and the sky had that late summer glow that makes everything look softer. As we pulled into the campground loop, I felt that old rush of recognition. The same trees, the same layout, even the same wooden sign near the entrance. But the feeling shifted almost immediately. While we were unloading the car and setting up our tents, we all noticed it at the same time. None of us said anything at first, but we kept glancing at each other. It was unbelievably quiet. Not normal quiet. Not peaceful forest quiet. It was heavy, thick, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. There were no birds calling overhead, no crickets chirping from the grass, no distant hum of cicadas like you usually hear on warm evenings. Even the wind moving through the leaves seemed muffled, like it was passing through something dense. I had camped in different states in different seasons. I knew what night in the woods usually sounded like. Even when it's calm, there's always something, a background layer of life. Here, there was nothing. "It's weirdly silent," one of my friends finally said. I laughed a little too quickly. "Maybe the wildlife moved deeper into the woods," I offered. "Or maybe it's just the humidity." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it fully. The silence didn't feel like animals hiding. It felt like absence. We finished setting up and lit a small fire. The crackle of the burning wood felt loud against the emptiness around us. We found ourselves talking more quietly than usual, not on purpose. It just felt wrong to raise our voices, like we were in a giant empty room and didn't want to hear our words echo back at us. I tried to brush off the unease. It was probably nostalgia mixing with imagination. I hadn't been there in years. Maybe it just felt different because I was seeing it through adult eyes. Eventually, we crawled into our tents. My boyfriend and I shared one. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling, listening. Nothing. No soft movement in the trees, no distant animal calls, just that heavy stillness. I remember thinking, this isn't normal, but I told myself I was overthinking it. I've slept through thunderstorms in the woods. I've camped in bear country. I wasn't someone who panicked easily. At some point, I fell asleep. I don't know how long I had been out when I woke up. It wasn't a gradual waking, it was sudden. My eyes snapped open before my mind caught up. Then I heard it, a deep metallic clang. It wasn't sharp like a spoon hitting a pot. It was heavier, like someone striking a thick metal drum with force. The sound seemed to come from the road that looped around the campground, close enough that I felt it in my chest. 5 seconds passed. Another clang, same volume, same tone. I held my breath and listened. 5 seconds, clang. It continued like that, steady, measured, every 5 seconds, like a metronome. There were no footsteps between the sounds, no crunch of gravel, no shifting of weight, just that metallic impact echoing through the loop. The campground was shaped in a circle, and the sound seemed to move along it. It didn't get louder or softer like someone approaching or walking away. It stayed the same. It just changed direction slightly, as if it was traveling around us. My heart started pounding. I tried to tell myself it was a camper, maybe someone messing around. Maybe someone had dropped something and was trying to fix it. But who walks silently through a campground at night, hitting metal every 5 seconds for 20 minutes? No one I could imagine. Animals didn't fit either. No animal makes that kind of metallic sound. And even if something bumped into a trash can or a pan, it wouldn't happen in perfect rhythm. 5 seconds, clang, 5 seconds, clang. It completed one full loop around the campground. I could feel it tracing the road outside our tent. Then it kept going. I wanted to wake my boyfriend. I really did, but I couldn't move. My body felt locked. It wasn't just fear, it was like my brain had decided that silence was survival. I've been scared before while camping, sudden noises, animals moving close, but this was different. It didn't feel wild or chaotic, it felt controlled, like something was doing it on purpose. The woods stayed silent the entire time. No birds startled into flight, no rustling from other campsites. It was like the whole forest was listening. The sound went on for what I later estimated was about 20 minutes. It never sped up, never slowed down, never broke pattern. Then it stopped, just like that. No final clang, no fading footsteps, just silence. The silence afterward felt even worse than before. It was heavier, pressing down on the tent like weight. I lay there for what felt like another hour, staring into the dark. My body slowly unlocked, but I didn't move much. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under. In the morning, sunlight filtering through the tent made everything feel almost normal again. Birds were chirping. I could hear distant movement from other campers. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it. But as soon as I stepped outside and saw my friend from the other tent, I asked, "Did you hear that last night?" 2 of them shook their heads. They had slept straight through. But the friend whose tent was closer to the road looked at me and said, "The metal banging." My stomach dropped. "Yes," I said. He described it exactly the way I remembered. The deep metallic clang, the steady rhythm, the way it moved around the loop. We laughed about it. Because what else do you do when something doesn't make sense? You make jokes. You turn it into a story. Maybe it was a moose, someone said. We all knew that made no sense. Moose don't carry metal objects. They don't hit things in rhythm, and they definitely don't move without making other noise. Still, we tried to come up with explanations. A maintenance worker? Some strange piece of equipment? Maybe someone had a loose trailer hitch. Later that day, I decided to ask the park ranger. I tried to keep it casual. I asked if moose were common in the area. She laughed and said it would be very unusual to see one there. Then I described the sound. She didn't laugh that time. She didn't immediately say, "Oh, that's just maintenance." She didn't offer a simple answer. Instead, she said she'd listen for anything strange that night. That response unsettled me more than anything. If there had been a known explanation, she would have said it right away. That night, we all went to sleep tense. Every little noise made us shift in our sleeping bags. A twig snapping somewhere far off made my heart race. But nothing like the night before happened. The woods were still quiet. Not completely dead like the first night, but not lively either. The next morning, an ambulance showed up at the campsite across from us. An older man had apparently needed medical help. It looked serious. For a brief moment, I wondered if maybe he had wandered around confused during the night. But the timing didn't quite line up, and my friends pointed out that if that had been the case, the ranger would have mentioned it when I asked. We packed up and left later that day, heading north to our next stop. For the rest of the weekend, we joked about the metal drummer of Vermont. We turned it into a funny story. But every time the conversation shifted into serious territory, none of us could offer a solid explanation. Months passed. Then, on the morning of October 23rd, I was scrolling through TikTok. A video popped up about something called the Bennington Triangle. I almost skipped it. I'm not someone who goes looking for paranormal content. I don't chase ghost stories or conspiracy theories, but curiosity got the better of me. As I looked into the location, I felt my stomach drop. Jamaica State Park sits just outside that area. I started reading more, stories about strange disappearances, reports of odd sounds in the woods, rhythmic noises, metallic banging heard late at night. People describing a suffocating silence before something unusual happened. The more I read, the more my chest tightened. The silence, the looping pattern, the metallic clang. It matched too closely. I wanted a normal explanation. I still do. I want someone to say it was a piece of loose construction equipment, or a staff member testing something, or some strange acoustic trick caused by the shape of the campground. Anything that makes sense, because the alternative is harder to sit with. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't chase legends, but I know what I heard. I know the rhythm. I know how deliberate it felt. And I know the way the forest held its breath that night. Every part of me wants to dismiss it, to box it up as coincidence. But sometimes when I lie awake and the room around me is too quiet, I can still hear it. 5 seconds, clang, 5 seconds, clang, steady, measured, moving in a slow circle. And I wonder if sometimes in certain places there are patterns we don't understand, sounds we can't place, spaces where the silence isn't empty, just waiting. I still camp, I still hike, I still love the woods, but I don't hear silence the same way anymore. In the summer of 2024, I took my off-road motorcycle into the wild parts of the Colville Indian Reservation in eastern Washington. I had been planning it for weeks. I didn't want a campground with picnic tables and loud groups staying up past midnight. I wanted space. I wanted heat and dust and distance from everything that felt modern. I wanted to feel small in a wide place. Out there, the land stretches in long ridges and dry valleys. Pine trees stand scattered across hills that turn golden under the sun. In the afternoon, the heat presses down hard, and the air shimmers above the dirt trails. I rode for hours without seeing another vehicle, another rider, or even distant smoke from a camp. My phone had no signal. The only sound most of the day was my engine and the wind in my helmet. By late afternoon, I was tired. My shoulders ached from riding rough terrain, and my mouth felt dry no matter how much water I drank. I crested a low ridge and coasted down into a shallow basin between hills. That's when I found it. It was a small pocket of shade shaped almost like a bowl, surrounded by trees that leaned inward slightly, as if they had grown to protect what lay inside. A narrow creek cut through the middle. It wasn't wide, maybe only a few feet across, but the water moved quickly over stones, making a steady rushing sound. The temperature dropped the moment I stepped into that shaded area. It felt at least 10 degrees cooler than the open hills above. I shut off the bike and let the silence settle. The difference was immediate. Without the engine, I could hear the creek clearly. The smell of pine and damp earth replaced the scent of hot metal and dust. It felt hidden. If you weren't standing right there, you wouldn't know it existed. The grassy clearing beside the creek was flat enough for a tent. Game trails crisscrossed the area, narrow lines pressed into the grass where animals regularly moved through. There were no signs of people, no footprints in the dirt, no ashes from a fire, no plastic or glass. It looked untouched. It felt perfect. I set up my tent facing the creek. I wanted the sound of the water to carry me to sleep. I laid out my sleeping bag, tucked my boots near the entrance, and arranged my gear beneath the branches overhead. The shade held the cool air longer than the rest of the land. Even as the sun dropped and the hills beyond glowed orange, the clearing stayed dim and calm. I sat outside my tent and read for a while. The creek's steady sound began to blur into the background, like white noise. It drowned out small insects and distant bird calls. It quieted my thoughts. I remember thinking that it felt like a place the world had forgotten, the kind of place that exists without needing witnesses. I crawled into my tent shortly after full dark. The sky above the tree line was clear and filled with stars. I fell asleep quickly, listening to the water move over stone. I don't know how long I slept. When I woke up, it wasn't gradual. It wasn't the slow drift from dream to awareness. It was instant, like someone had snapped their fingers inside my skull. For a second, I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard it, a massive, deep thud. It wasn't close to the tent. It came from somewhere near the creek. But it was heavy enough that I felt it in my chest as much as I heard it. It wasn't the sharp crack of a branch. It wasn't a rock rolling. It was the kind of impact that carries weight behind it. I pushed myself up on my elbows and looked at my watch. 12:14 a.m. Even in that moment, I noticed the time clearly. It felt important. It felt like a detail I would need later. I stayed completely still. For a few seconds, the only sound was the creek again. Then I realized something else. The creek's steady rhythm had changed. Not stopped entirely, but broken. There were splashes now, small at first, then heavier. Water displaced by something large moving through it. I didn't reach for the zipper. I didn't shine a light. The opening of my tent faced slightly away from the creek, and I was grateful for that. Every instinct I had told me to stay quiet. I slowed my breathing and listened. Another splash. Then the subtle shift of weight. The sound of something lowering itself. Damp soil compressing under pressure. Not a quick movement, a deliberate one. And then I heard it. A sigh. It was long and deep. Not like a human sigh of annoyance or relief. It sounded like air leaving lungs much larger than mine. Heavy, slow, controlled. My skin prickled. I had camped around wildlife before. I had heard deer move at night. I had heard coyotes yipping at a distance. I had even heard a black bear rummage near a campsite years earlier. This didn't match any of those sounds. This felt grounded, present, like something had stepped directly into the center of the clearing and was aware of everything in it. The splashing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint rush of water again. Then I heard footsteps. Not running, not scrambling. Slow steps moving away from the creek and up the hill behind my camp. Each one placed with weight and confidence. No panic, no hurry, just movement. The steps faded gradually. They didn't break into a sprint. They didn't circle back. They simply moved uphill until I couldn't hear them anymore. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding in my ears. The night returned to its normal sound, but it felt different now, charged. Every rustle of leaves made me tense. I kept expecting another sound, another thud, but nothing came. I didn't sleep again until the light began to change inside the tent. When birds started calling at dawn, it felt like a release, like permission to breathe again. In the morning, now everything seemed almost unreal. The clearing looked exactly the same. The sky was bright. The air was warming quickly. By midday, it would push past 100 degrees again. I stepped out of the tent and stretched. The ground away from the creek was hard and packed from the heat. It wouldn't show tracks easily, but near the water's edge, the soil was darker and softer. That's where I saw it. A single impression. Huge. I walked closer and crouched down. It wasn't shaped like a hoof. It wasn't narrow like a deer. It wasn't a paw print. It looked like the back half of a human foot, a heel, an enormous heel. I placed my size 12 camp shoe next to it. My shoe fit inside the impression, with room to spare. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself I was misreading it. Maybe the edge had crumbled and made it look bigger. Maybe the lighting was casting shadows that exaggerated it. So I tested it. I stepped into the softest part of the mud and pressed down with my full weight. 200 pounds of me barely sank in more than a quarter inch. The impression beside me was more than an inch deep, maybe closer to 2. The soil around it was compressed in a way that suggested real weight. I looked more closely. There were no visible toe marks, nothing in front of the arch, just the heel portion, long and wide, as if something had placed its heel down firmly while leaning forward to drink from the creek. I scanned the area for additional prints. There were none. No matching second heel, no full footprint, no animal tracks crossing the clearing, not even my own from the night before in that specific patch of mud. Just that one deep mark. I checked my motorcycle boots. The heel tread on them was distinct, with sharp edges and patterns. If I had made that impression, there would have been clear lines and shapes. The print by the creek was smooth, broad, undefined. I searched for broken branches, bent grass, disturbed rocks. Nothing stood out. The clearing looked the same as it had when I set up camp. If something had moved through it, it had done so carefully. Standing there in the growing heat of morning, I felt something shift inside me. I have always considered myself rational. I don't jump to strange conclusions. I look for simple explanations first. But I ran through every animal I knew lived in that region. A bear. Bears leave paw prints with clear claws. They dig. They disturb ground when they drink. And I had heard no snorting. No heavy breathing typical of a bear. An elk or moose. They leave split hooves deep and obvious. And they move differently in water. A cougar. Too light. Too quiet in a different way. Nothing matched the weight implied by that heel. Nothing matched the sound of that thud I had felt in my chest. I thought back to the moment I woke up. The way the creek's steady sound had been interrupted. The sigh, the footsteps moving uphill without hesitation. I was miles from the nearest campers. I had passed no one on the trails. There were no roads close enough for someone to walk in without me noticing earlier in the day. A very large being had come down that hill. It had stepped into the clearing. It had walked into the creek and drunk from it. It had stood close enough to my tent that I heard its breath. And it had left without leaving a trail. The only mark it left behind was that single heel impression, like a signature pressed into soft ground. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. I didn't feel panic. I felt something closer to acceptance. The only explanation that fit every detail, the weight, the sound, the behavior, the isolation, was one I would normally never choose first. I believe it was a Sasquatch, not because I wanted it to be, not because I was chasing a story, but because nothing else fit. For years, I had heard about sightings in the Pacific Northwest. I had listened politely, always assuming there was some other explanation. Misidentification, imagination, fear, exaggerating memory. But I know what I heard that night. I know the sound of something heavy stepping into water. I know the difference between wind and breath. I know the feeling of being quietly observed. I still camp. I still ride into remote areas. I refuse to let one experience take that away from me. But now, when I find a place that feels too cool, too quiet, too perfectly hidden, I pause longer before setting up. I listen harder. I pay attention to the space around me, because sometimes the wilderness isn't empty. Sometimes it's simply shared. And somewhere in eastern Washington, in a shaded bowl beside a narrow creek, something passed through my camp in the dark and left behind a single mark to prove it. My aunt has owned a huge piece of land in northwest Connecticut for as long as I can remember. It's over 100 acres, and most of it is untouched woodland. Tall trees packed tightly together, narrow creeks that twist through the undergrowth, and long stretches of forest where the light filters down in thin green beams. It sits inside a state park that barely has any permanent residents. Backpackers pass through sometimes, a few hikers in the summer, but most days it feels like the land belongs only to the trees and whatever moves between them. Getting there is part of the experience. You drive for miles on narrow roads that curve through dense forest. Cell service fades out long before you reach her driveway. After a certain point, you stop expecting to see another car. The world feels smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because there's nothing but woods around you. Larger because it feels endless. The house was already there when she bought the property. Old, run down. The kind of place that looked like it had stories buried in its beams. She remodeled it slowly over the years, adding warmth and comfort. But the bones of the house still feel older than the updates. The floorboards creak in places they've always creaked. The windows frame the forest like paintings, except the pictures move. I've been going there every year since I was a baby. The farm, we called it, even though it wasn't a traditional farm. My aunt adopted rescue animals over time, miniature horses, alpacas, donkeys. When I was very young, there were ducks that wandered around the yard like they owned it. The animals stayed in the cleared pasture near the house. The rest of the land, most of it, was forest. In the early 2000s, my aunt put up a 12-foot fence around about 80 acres of the property. I remember asking her why something that tall was necessary. She laughed it off at first, but later she admitted she hated the sound of coyotes howling close to the house at night. She also hinted at creepy encounters that she never fully explained. I was still a kid then, and she didn't want to scare me. We're originally from the bayous of Louisiana, swamps and slow rivers. Moving into deep New England forest must have felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The woods there are older somehow, denser, quieter. As a child, I learned the layout of the land quickly. I wandered everywhere. I knew which creeks ran shallow in summer and which spots filled with frogs in the evenings. I had favorite places where I liked to sit alone and pretend the forest belonged to me. My favorite was at the top of a small foothill deep in the woods, near the far corner of the cleared pasture. The trees grew taller there. The light came through in a hazy green glow. I visited so often that I wore a small path into the earth with my footsteps. It felt like my place. In 2008, when I was around 10, I brought my friend Alex on our annual summer trip. She had visited before, so she wasn't completely new to the property. One afternoon, we hiked out to my favorite spot. We sat under the trees with our iPod touches, listening to Katy Perry and playing Doodle Jump. We were half wild kids and half glued to tiny screens. It was ordinary until it wasn't. There wasn't a sound that started it, no branch snapping, no animal call. It was a feeling. The air changed. That's the only way I can describe it. It felt like the entire forest inhaled and didn't exhale. The breeze stopped. The leaves froze mid-shift. The birds stopped calling. Even the insects seemed to vanish. I paused the music and looked at Alex. She was already looking at me. Her face was pale, eyes wide. She didn't need to say anything. I could see that she felt it too. We sat there, silent, waiting for something normal to happen. A bird chirp, a squirrel rustling, a fly buzzing past our ears. Nothing. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt intentional. Then we heard it. At first, it was faint. A soft crunch of leaves from somewhere below the hill. The foothills sloped steeply on that side. It was thick with brush and loose rocks, hard to climb even slowly. The sound came again, clearer. Heavy footsteps, not the light skittering of a deer, not the uneven thump of a bear moving through brush. These were measured, solid, weighty. They were coming up the hill toward us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Alex nodded immediately. Her lower lip trembled. "It sounds like footsteps," I said. Another nod. The footsteps didn't hesitate. They didn't circle. They moved straight up the slope with long strides, brushing through undergrowth like it wasn't even there. I knew that terrain. Even as a kid, I knew how difficult that climb was. Whatever was coming up that hill was moving too smoothly, too quickly. I grabbed Alex's hand and we ran. We didn't scream. We didn't look back. We just ran. I remember being terrified of tripping, terrified of feeling something grab my ankle. The path I had made over years of wandering became our lifeline. We flew down it, branches snapping against our arms, dirt sliding under our shoes. I could still hear it behind us. The footsteps didn't sound frantic, they sounded controlled, close. We didn't stop until the house came into view. Even then, we didn't slow down. We ran all the way to the porch and bent over, gasping for air. We didn't tell anyone right away. It felt too strange, too unreal. The next day, curiosity pushed us to go back. Alex didn't want to. I could see it in her face, but she agreed if we stayed together. We walked more slowly this time. We scanned the ground, the trees, the brush. There were no obvious footprints, no broken branches marking a clear path up the hill. I slid a little way down the slope to look closer, but the fear returned so sharply that I scrambled back up almost immediately. We sat down again at the top, trying to act normal. We turned the music back on, laughed too loudly, pretended we were fine. Then the forest went still again. This time it felt sharper, heavier. The silence dropped like a curtain, and the footsteps started almost immediately. Closer, faster, coming from the right side this time, where the incline was slightly easier. They were moving directly toward us. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Alex's hand and ran again. This time I felt the footsteps closer than before, close enough that my heart pounded in my ears. The sound wasn't crashing or chaotic. It was deliberate, strong, almost human, but wrong. We ran harder than we ever had before. We didn't stop until we reached the house again. That was the first time something in those woods made itself known to me. Years passed, but the feeling stayed. On another summer visit, something else happened. I was sleeping in the living room with my mom. The room had large windows and sliding glass doors that looked directly into the forest. During the day, they were beautiful. At night, they felt like open eyes staring into darkness. I couldn't sleep. The woods were silent again. That same unnatural silence. Then came a loud crack, like someone hitting a dead tree with a thick piece of wood. It happened again. Rhythmic, each crack spaced out evenly like a signal. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. My aunt's cat, normally shy and rarely seen, suddenly sprinted into the room. Her fur stood straight up along her spine. She hissed and yowled in a way I had never heard before. She ran to the glass doors and clawed at them, spitting and snarling like something stood just beyond the reflection. I tried to see past the glare of the glass, but the forest was pitch black. There was nothing visible, only the cat's reflection and her violent reaction. That same suffocating fear filled the room. We didn't open the door, we didn't turn on the porch light, we just sat there and listened. Eventually, the silence lifted. The night sounds returned slowly, but something had shifted. Even now, years later, whenever I step into a forest and the air suddenly goes still, I think about those footsteps. That heavy, measured sound climbing the hill. The way the forest froze around us like it was aware of something moving through it. I still don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't nothing, and I know it moved like a person, only not one.